Anyone who has been to Paris has almost certainly been to Notre Dame. And anyone who is watching the news on April 15th, 2019, will remember it nearly burning down. As a result either of a cigarette butt or an electrical short, oddly enough on a part of the cathedral that was older wood and in need of repair, the top of Notre Dame was almost destroyed. Much more could have gone up in flames. But the firefighters managed to save the building. And most or nearly all of the artifacts and art and other pieces within Notre Dame, especially the ancient windows, were spared. What I found interesting is that shortly after the fire, there was a lot of chatter about what to do. Almost immediately, French politicians lobbied for the church to be restored, and there was a lot of fundraising efforts that had a lot of enthusiasm from people around the world, not just the French. Then, oddly enough, a few voices argued that the cathedral should not just be restored to its original design, but that this might be an opportunity to modernize. And then folks got upset. People began to argue back and forth that the church should be restored, quote, to how it was in the 12th century. That immediately caught my ear, because oddly enough, the part that burned down was not from the 12th century, or the Middle Ages, or even the Renaissance. The wooden spire in question, and much of the other parts, are actually modern, from the 19th century. And while I don't want this video to be a gotcha piece, I do find that Notre Dame provides a unique window into history. It is a rare building, standing as it does at the historic place there in Paris. It used to be more or less across the street from the administrative and royal heart of all of France. It was also instrumental in the flourishing of perhaps the greatest academic outpouring in all of French history, with the rise of the cathedral school associated with Notre Dame. It would later move across the street and become known as the University of Paris. To put it simply, both Aquinas and Abelard were involved with this school, and they would have attended Mass in Notre Dame. And there are more influences in art and music that I can't even begin to do justice to. And that, by the way, is just the Middle Ages. Add to it the role that Notre Dame played in the Reformation, that rose up and failed in the heart of Paris, the near destruction of the cathedral during the French Revolution, and the fact that Napoleon himself held his self-coronation here in Notre Dame in order to restore it to preeminence. Oh yes, and let's not forget about the Hunchback of Notre Dame.
You're telling me I'm losing to a bird!
So Notre Dame de Paris stands as a witness to the long history of France that is really remarkable. So let's look at that story. In the middle of the Seine River, there is an island which, depending on your imagination, looks like a ship or maybe a baguette. The island is roughly 3/4 of a mile long and uniquely situated as both a landmark for the region and also, at least in the ancient world, a defensible plot of land, surrounded by water on all sides. The importance of this island goes back even before the Romans. There was at one time a Celtic tribe called the Parisii, who worshipped their various deities, overseen by Druid priests. That region was conquered around 50 AD by Rome, which converted the existing site to the worship of Jupiter. After that, a wall was erected around the island for greater security, and Rome ruled that region for the next several centuries. One fun fact for those who visit Paris today, in the 1960s, demo work for a new building was underway, and the dig opened up what would become the excavation of part of this period from Roman history. You can visit the archaeological crypt and see the ruins now. So someone was worshiping on this island back before there were even records kept. But that Roman world would become Christianized after the rise of Constantine. The temple to Jupiter was removed, and another church was built there in its place. This time, a church dedicated to the first martyr of the church, St. Stephen. That older church was roughly half the size of Notre Dame today, and on either side there were two smaller churches, one of which was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, or Notre Dame. So in a sense, that smaller church is the origin of Notre Dame as we know it today. After centuries, tragedy struck, In 856, the Vikings sailed up the Seine River and conquered the city of Paris. According to the terms of surrender, Paris was allowed to keep 3 churches, and the rest were razed to the ground. The damage to Paris overall was extensive. So already, before we even get to the High Middle Ages, you can see that there's a long history here on the island. First it was Celtic, then it was Roman, and then it was part of that early Christian expansion by Constantine. However, because the Vikings destroy most of Paris, essentially what you have is that by the time you get to the High Middle Ages in a bit, you have a bit of a blank slate, or you at least have opportunity to build something new. Of course, the most important period of development that we have for Notre Dame is in the 12th century. And we have to understand what's going on here. Despite the reputation of the Middle Ages as being a time of darkness and backwardness, it was actually a time of rapid expansion and invention, though modern convenience sometimes make it hard to appreciate just how much these advancements were progressing. Developments in architecture kind of pale in comparison to the latest iPhone. But this new style of architecture we know today as Gothic. Now, Gothic also has a bad rap. It, too, is often considered in the popular imagination as dark and dank and moody. Obviously, people who adhere to the Gothic aesthetic seem to find themselves dressing in darker colors. That is a bit of a misnomer because modern Gothic sensibilities actually come more from the Victorian era. We even call it Victorian Gothic. Gothic architecture, however, from the Middle Ages, is something else entirely. Actually, in many ways, it's the exact opposite. Gothic architecture is about light and vaulting and expansiveness. I don't have time to go into all the details, but Gothic-style cathedrals were designed to actually let in more light, not less. And there arose the new invention of stained glass that made Gothic cathedrals in their day a riot of color. Perhaps the most important, and certainly the first cathedral in France to reach to the heavens in this way, was Saint-Denis, a bit to the north of Paris. Now, Saint-Denis is important enough that maybe somewhere long down the line I might cover it in a video. But suffice to say, Saint-Denis was the envy of most bishops throughout France. Well, the Bishop of France was a man by the name of Maurice de Sully, a wealthy man in his own right, well-educated, and well-connected. In fact, he was the childhood friend of King Louis VII, and it was Bishop Sully's idea to refound Notre Dame as a cathedral that would rival Saint-Denis. And with the patronage of the royal family, work began in 1163. Because it was so well funded, Notre Dame had the privilege of being built rapidly. You'll see this often in medieval cathedrals, where it is begun in one century and not finished for many centuries later. That's often a problem of funding. Well, Notre Dame did not have that problem. Yes, the final touches were put on Notre Dame 150 years later, when things like the transept and other features were expanded. But the principal construction of Notre Dame, as we see it today when we enter, was finished in a matter of really just a few decades. But there are several features that we want to note already. First and foremost, the flying buttresses. Of course, a flying buttress like this provide support for these high vertical walls, and they, as it were, lean into them and allow them to not fall outward and remain stronger. Now, it's sometimes confused that flying buttresses were invented here in the Gothic age. That's not true. There were buttresses going back centuries, but they were not common in the Middle Ages. Notre Dame was probably the first to use these buttresses for the new Gothic style of high vertical walls. And given Notre Dame's importance and popularity ever since, some have come to the belief that Notre Dame invented them. But a better way of seeing it, Notre Dame introduced them to Gothic architecture, not only for structural reasons, but also, as they are seen today, for their own beauty. They really are quite striking. Secondly, the original building was very long and very tall, to put it mildly. There was no spire in the middle, and some of the other features that we think of as quintessentially Notre Dame, such as the gargoyles, were not there in the 12th century. The initial building campaign focused on the main vaulted center that greets you when you enter. The other feature that they focused on was installing the stained glass. The north rose window, with the ornate stained glass of Mary and figures of the Old Testament, is original, and in the 12th and 13th century, other large stained glass windows were added and they were a sight to behold. The south rose window features artwork that depicts Christ as the center as it faced the south, and it would have received more light, suggesting Christ as the light of the world. So what you have here is a north window with those pointing to Christ, Old Testament, all the way up to the Annunciation and the coming of the angel to Mary. And then on the south side, you have Christ, the light of the world, as the center. But already by the 13th century, when you walk into Notre Dame, your eye goes up to an impressive cathedral in this new Gothic style, full of light, and when looking through the stained glass, full of color. Standing as long as it has, and being the center of French politics, as Notre Dame certainly was, means that it has suffered several major setbacks that forever shaped the way we see the cathedral today. These setbacks were actually attacks on the cathedral itself. The first came in the Reformation, and this is by far the weakest attack. French Protestants, of course, were in the camp of what we know today as the Reformed faith. Unlike Lutherans, Reformed churches were very much opposed to statuary, images, and usually stained glass in church. There's lots of reasons for that, which I won't go into now. But needless to say, the French Huguenots saw Notre Dame and other churches in Paris as an affront to God. And while the king had tolerated French Protestants for a while, after some Calvinists became unruly and began to complain and somewhat press for stronger measures against the church, eventually the French crown sided with the Catholic Church. This culminated in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre with the slaughter of a number of French Huguenots. They then scattered, many of them settling in other countries, and some even coming to the New World. Notre Dame still stood. This was followed by a brief attack, if you want to call it that, by Louis XIV, the Sun King, who decided, more or less by his own sensibilities, to remove the rood loft, which was this dividing partition in medieval churches between the priests on the far side and the laity on the near side, and they were separated by this thing called a rood loft. That was removed. And then perhaps something that was a little less forgivable, Louis had significant portions of the stained glass removed, and clear glass was put in its place. This was mostly due to fashionable sensibilities of the day. Clear glass was becoming all the rage. The far more devastating attack on Notre Dame, though, was the French Revolution. Now, this revolution deserves a video on its own right, but as it relates to Notre Dame, the impact was devastating. The revolution lasted roughly 10 years, from 1789 to 1799, when men like Robespierre led a revolt, not only against the royal family, but against what they perceived to be too close an association between church and state. And they weren't wrong. There had been for many centuries a strong correlation between Notre Dame and the royal family. By the 18th century, that connection was increasingly vilified. Men like Voltaire, who wrote just prior to the Revolution, were some of the most vocal critics of this connection. As a result, when the Revolution got underway, the anger spilled from the royal halls onto Notre Dame itself. Famously, on the facade that many enter today, there were statues lining the top of what we know today to be Old Testament kings. But at the time, given the hot-blooded nature of this revolution, they were mistaken for French kings. Or at the very least, they were targeted for being kings in general. These statues were pulled down and beheaded, and in fact much of the facade was damaged or lost entirely. Stained glass was broken. Above all, Notre Dame ceased for a time to even be a cathedral. It was converted in what the revolutionaries called the Festival of Reason. The altar was removed, and an altar to liberty was installed instead. Over the cathedral doors, as I said, the art was disfigured, and the words "to philosophy" were carved into the stonework instead. Actors were hired to come and impersonate the embodiment of reason herself. But those elites who ran the revolution believed that this was the overthrowing of religion itself. Notre Dame was now reduced not to rubble, but almost to rubble. In fact, the cathedral was spared from certain destruction, just in the nick of time. There were plans to sell off all the stone to be used in other building projects. So when you get to 1800, Notre Dame as we know it today does not exist. It has been almost crushed. under the weight of the French Revolution. But an unlikely hero came in the person of Napoleon. As part of his Concordat in 1801, Napoleon restored Catholicism to a place of privilege within French political rule, though with new limitations on this power. You see, Napoleon realized that his empire was going to need the will of the people, who still remained largely Catholic, no matter how much the French elites and the philosophers had tried to overthrow religion. So in this case, Napoleon took a middle ground. He wanted churches and he wanted them restored, but he refused to allow his power, political power, to be subsumed under the church or to be somehow entangled with the church itself. As a case in point, Napoleon refused to allow the bishop to crown him king during his coronation. He received the church's blessing, but he placed, this is very Napoleon, he placed the crown upon his own head and then on his wife. But what's interesting is the site that Napoleon chose for the ceremony was in fact Notre Dame. He ordered that as much be done to fix the cathedral before the event as was possible, though the extent of the damage was too great to do more than dress up the damaged facade and lay down rugs to cover up all the damage. Notre Dame was still largely in ruins. But the will was there. The desire was there to bring it back to its former glory. Napoleon, though, had other fish to fry, and the eagerness to fix Notre Dame was a little bit slow in growing. And then came the person of Victor Hugo and the famous Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is what we call it in English, though the title in French is simply Notre Dame de Paris. Hugo, you see, loved Notre Dame. He actually spends several chapters in his book describing in great detail the Gothic architecture as poetry or art in stone. In his story of Quasimodo, Esmeralda, the Romani woman, and Frollo, the sadistic and snobby elite of the French justice system, hit just the right note for that day. Note the themes: the outcasts of society, Quasimodo and Esmeralda, centered around Notre Dame, as those in secular power oppress and beat them down. Obviously, the tropes here would have been instantly recognizable in Hugo's day, just after the Revolution. But Hugo essentially places Notre Dame squarely in the forefront of the rising sense of national pride for the French. There was this rising romantic movement, as we call it today, centered on French culture. And as a result, the cathedral, and in fact much of what we consider to be quintessentially Paris life, was developed in this century from 1800 to 1900. The streets were widened, and the neoclassical designs we all love today were funded extensively. And Notre Dame was given, finally, a serious restoration as one of the jewels of Paris. The facade and statuary were replaced, unfortunately, with replicas. Yes, what you look at today is largely a reproduction. And the spire, the same spire that burned down a few years ago, was erected in a somewhat controversial move to make it more modern. The design, by the way, is simply not from the Middle Ages. It is very much part of this Romantic movement. The 12 disciples in copper were also added, and famously the one that is Thomas is fashioned to look like the designer of the architect from this phase of the restoration. More importantly, the things that we often associate most with Notre Dame, the chimera and the gargoyles, were added at this time as well. Many of the gargoyles even serve as waterspouts that direct water away from the building, and some of the gargoyles themselves are alleged to be inspired directly by the story of Hunchback of Notre Dame itself. And so when you look at Notre Dame today, and when it is restored, you're looking at an incredible building in history, standing nearly 1,000 years, suffering punishment by its enemies, and later by fire, and yet always part of the center of French life. Today, it is hard to imagine Paris without Notre Dame. On April 15th, 2024, the cathedral is set to reopen, and it will endure, I'm sure, for centuries to come.